Right, so we have lifted the axle out, okay, although that's what we would have done, but on this particular quirk of a kart, it lended itself better to sliding the axle through. So we've got a drift. I mean, you don't have to have a bespoke drift like this, anything that would kind of plasticky that would cut round an axle. What we then needed to do is unscrew these little grub screws that you'll find in here. They're simply to fasten the axle in place. There's a set on each bearing. Once you've done that, you will have needed to loosen the brake disc, okay, and then tap, 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 make sure everything's loose and tap the axle through, okay. Once you've got rid of that old axle that crucially doesn't have that keyway in that position, you then get your axle ready to go that does have, eventually, once it's fired itself through, a keyway in that position. So it's then a bit like kind of threading beads on a necklace, all right? So whilst this was on the outside originally, once we start threading this through, that's then going to be mounted on the inside, inboarding that sprocket. Crucially, you're going to think I'm bonkers, but there's two chains. One chain is the chain that we will run from the sprocket to the engine. The second chain, a big recommendation, is to have a larger and or a smaller chain, so that when you change the sprocket size, you might need a slightly different chain size. But fundamentally, as long as you've got two chains on there, let's say your chain snaps or breaks, you're not having to feed an axle back in. You can just use the one that's on there and mount it. So we're going to hook effectively two chains on as we feed that through. You'll obviously re-feed through your brake disc. At that point, tap it back through that bearing. You'll then put your hub, which you mount your wheel to, on the end. At that point, once it's all set like that, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but you've obviously got to make sure that it is symmetrical. So at that point, you're doing very fine taps to make sure that there's the same gap between that bearing and the outside of the axle, and the same gap between that bearing and the outside of the axle. So just to summarize, tapping it in, feed your sprocket carrier on. Sprocket, you can see we've mounted a disc protector to that at the same time. Then you're going to feed two chains on, very important. Brake disc, feed it through, hub on. Once you're happy that it's symmetrical, then tighten these grub screws up and you're locked in place.